Let's begin with a brief prayer from Valley of Vision. Pray with me. O Lord God, who inhabitest eternity, the heavens declare thy glory, the earth thy riches, the universe is thy temple, thy presence fills immensity. Yet thou hast of thy pleasure created life and communicated happiness. Thou hast made me what I am and given me what I have, and in thee I live and move and have my being. Amen. Well, we come to the fifth episode of this series that we're doing, Have We Lost Our Minds? An initiative of Crossroads Community Church this year. And as I did last week, I think I'll suggest this week something that happened in class. So as you know, I teach at IUPUI, and I'm in the English department, and this last week I was encouraging my students in their papers toward a persuasive paper. So in this case, I was emphasizing to them that there were actually consequences to their position, whatever their position may be. And so in this case, I gave a whole long slide presentation, which I won't go into this morning, except to say that this is the title slide of that presentation. And here is but one of those slides. This last year, The Atlantic actually produced an editorial page, which was actually a whole article, on this idea that the last children of Down syndrome were here. Namely that there was going to be an abortion process whereby we could eliminate those who had Down syndrome. Of course, the word abortion is never used in places like the Atlantic. They just assume that everybody understands that's exactly what we're going to be doing. And so in my case, one of the examples that I was giving about consequence was, do you understand the consequence or the cost of abortion? But of course, then we have to go to the Washington Post, which a couple of weeks ago identified Ms. Cohen, suggested that she didn't want our God in charge of her health care, which fascinates me considering that her health care actually comes from a Hebraic Christian point of view and not from a Friedrich Nietzsche atheist point of view. Now, once you establish hospitals with the name Nietzsche, I think you'll be okay. You can go ahead and go to those hospitals. But until then, you got to deal with St. Mark's and St. Luke's and all the rest. The Christian history of health care is long-standing. Well, this idea of our humanity goes even further, because in another session with my students, we were talking about the consequence of what does it mean to view people in a certain way. And in this case, it was a negative way. So I was telling them a story about when I was in, what was that, third or fourth grade, I think, fifth grade. This was my name, Echo the Elephant, because I was short and fat. Of course, back in those days, we called ourselves Husky, didn't we? You remember that? Husky pants? Yeah. For those of you teenagers who don't have a clue, just understand that body shaming is nothing new. It's been going on for decades and centuries and millennia, which makes me always think of this movie, Shallow Hal, where you have this real focus that came out of Hollywood, a good thing, actually, that emphasizes this very statement at the top of the page. You're just a little fixated on the outside, beauty comes from the inside, that's it. Well, yeah. But my question about us as we think about our image is, do we actually judge people based on their appearance? Do you judge people based on their height or their weight or their good looks, depending on how you evaluate good? And I would always say this to my progressive friends. So when you say that this isn't right, that we shouldn't do this, by what standard will you evaluate? We talked about standards last week. And from my conservative friends, I would say, why do I have to wait for my progressive friends to point this stuff out? Because quite frankly, sometimes some of the worst examples of how we deal with human image when it comes to comparison in the world actually comes from folks who have a very conservative point of view. Which always makes me think about this movie, which, by the way, on the back side of the handout this morning is actually an understanding, at least my understanding of this film, And you can get a snapshot by reading that of how I go about thinking about movies and why I think movies are really important and powerful. So you can see some of the ideas there, and in fact, see what I was actually praying when I was a kid, that I would be an astronaut, which, obviously didn't ever take place, though I think that being an astronaut and being a theologian kind of go together at some point. So nonetheless, the idea of Gattaca is that there was a perfectionism, and that you were evaluated based on your genes, your genetic code, and you were being prejudiced against because of how your genetic code lined up with whatever perfectionism was established in that culture and society. This kind of thinking is everywhere. This kind of thinking overruns our culture, just generally speaking, and it's important to point out films like this. So when I talk about this, the episode 5 being image is everything, we have to come back to our slide that I mentioned to you I would show over and over and over again, and that is that we have to understand that our thinking about life and things and doctrine begins with these two pillars, namely, who says and how do you view humans? Now, just as a commercial break, I would suggest that if you really don't want to hear bad things about humans, you don't come next week, because I'll be teaching on Bad to the Bone, which comes from that great 1982 rock music song. And for those of you who are interested, you can Google that right now and check that out. That will be the title of next week's session, because while we as Christians declare that all people are made in God's image and are dignified, and that's important, dignified, we have worth, value, and dignity. At the same time, we are the other D word, which is depraved, which is probably better understood as conceived in sin and understanding that sin permeates our person. So both of those things at the same time. These two pillars uphold every single understanding of every topic, every subject, everything in life. I continue to tell my colleagues at university that these are the two things that we really need to address. And of course, they come at things from a very different point of view, thinking that humans are perfectible, which is really kind of strange and interesting to me, considering the consequences of those choices. But nonetheless. So you remember a couple of episodes ago or a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching on this, nothing but dirt, and I was emphasizing the idea that if we come from the ground, that is, if there is no God who has created us in his image, then indeed we are simply an evolutionary byproduct. And there are all kinds of real bad things that come because of that. So here's that list that I gave you in that particular session. So the difference between a designed universe and a chance universe. A chance universe is based on an evolutionary point of view that we're going to get better and better as humans, and that things started out really bad but are getting always better and good. The Disneyfication, I call it, of our culture, where this is really our view of life and things. The designed universe, on the other hand, is where we as Christians start and think. And you'll notice on the fourth line down, I emphasize this during that particular session. Humans have personhood with worth, value, and dignity, or humans are producers that worth is based on what is done. So if you use the phrase, "What have you done for me lately?" you are viewing whoever you are saying that to as a producer. You basically are viewing them not as people, not as a person, but as somebody who's going to do something for you. And if they don't, then that counts against them. So you see the difference here between personhood and production. We'll get into this a little bit more as we go on, but I wanted to emphasize that this was some groundwork that we laid a few weeks ago, which always makes me think of Gothic horror literature. So, by the way, remember that when you're referencing Frankenstein, you're talking about Dr. Frankenstein. The doctor was the monster. And the monster made these kinds of comments. Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous, and magnificent? There's the dignity of humanity. Yet so vicious and base, men appear to me to be monsters. So the real monster is the one looking back at you in your reflection in the mirror. The problem with the world, as G.K. Chesterton once said, is me. So, saying all of that and prepping ourselves for next week, let's get back to Image is Everything and why it's important for Christians to actually understand that we are made in God's image. So, what makes people people and not animals or machines? I'd like to point out just a couple of words here that suggest that we really have a wrong view of how we use words. Being a teacher and somebody who studies theology, I really care deeply for words. So when I think about using words like, I do what I do by instinct, I'm asking myself the question of that individual, do they really view themselves as an animal? Animals do things out of instinct. I don't. I actually do things based on, let's say, my conscience or prescription from revelation from God, but I do not do things out of instinct. There are not any hard wiring going on in my person. I'm not a machine either. So we really should be very wary of the kinds of words that we choose to use when it comes to our own personhood and why that might be instructive for helping us to understand how we think differently and our minds are changed by the Christian view of things. So, in light of all of that, I'd like to suggest 3 ideas here about being made in the image of God, and as always, all of these things are on your handouts. We were given special consideration. So 3 times the word created is used in Genesis chapter 1. So we are the pinnacle of creation as far as God is concerned. Human life is going to be the life that is going to be the co-regent, the co-ruler with God over all things. That was the original intention of God. Now, of course, we see this throughout Scripture. We understand, for instance, when Jesus was asked about paying taxes, and he made that famous line, give to Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God's. What was he saying? He was saying the image on the coin is a coin of currency, payment for taxation. The image of God is implanted on the individual person. So you give to Caesar money, but you give to God that which is his, which is all people made in God's image. And it is the basis and reason for saying we bear responsibility to love our neighbor, no matter who, by the way, that neighbor might be. So there's another distinctive here in Genesis, and that is that we were given special attention. There are 2 phrases here that stand out. God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into man the breath of life. So there was very distinct difference between what was going on with the animals and what was going on with humanity, not said of the other creation around Adam and Eve at that time. So when we're talking about this, we have to think about how does God's attributes actually impact how we're thinking about our image. So very first episode that we did, very first teaching, we were emphasizing this idea of transcendence and immanence. Transcendence meaning that God is outside of us, separate, apart from us, and that immanence is God is close to and cares for his creation. So why is the fact that we use logic or rhetoric or wisdom important? Well, that's because we bear the image of God. And because God is this way, logical and rhetorical and wisdom, full of wisdom, we learn based on the patterns that God has ordained. And at the same time, we practice health care, back to Ms. Cohen's comment, and counseling and caring for people that shows the interest of God through us. So the attributes of God come through the image of God to us. This is huge and important as we think about how we actually should relate to our world. And there is a third distinctive. We were given a special image. God's stamp, a signet ring, literally. We are God's representation and his representative. So back in the day that this was written, book of Genesis, the king wore a ring. And the ring had inscribed on it a certain value or a certain mark. And that mark was the mark of the king. So whenever you saw that mark, you knew that the king's image had been implanted and specifically was used in clay tablets for documentation of whatever might be, contracts and so on. So the idea is that we are literally stamped by God in his image, with his image, and that this ring is indicative of the fact that we are his representation and his representative. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's give some examples, and let's start with video games. One of the reasons why video games are so popular, aside from the obvious reasons, is because oftentimes video games are based on the idea that you are eliminating the enemy. You are eliminating the competition. So why is that so important for us to recognize and understand? Because even video games, in their own way, reflect the concern that God has in the book of Genesis, when he made it very clear that if somebody kills somebody else, that his blood will be recompensed. That is, there will be a reckoning for his action towards somebody else. And why was this? Because this person had been made in the image of God. So it's important that we think about this. By the way, in a few weeks, we'll actually be talking about justice and the importance of that for a Christian view of life and things. But we want to at least acknowledge that this is the reason why we actually care about justice. It's important to us because it's important to God. And so we see movies like this, that people who stand up against evildoers and evil things. And notice that the First Testament is teaching this consistently all the way through. So I'll just run through these 4 ideas here. There is an equality of commitment to all people being made in God's image. Nobody's left out. There are no special classes of individuals. Number 2, there's equitable rewards which benefit all people. That's part of the imaging process. We are benefited because we are made in God's image. There is also a standard of justice which is applied to all. Those 2 chapters in Isaiah 58 and 59. If you want to know anything at all about God's justice, read Isaiah 58 and 59 and how that justice actually should be applied in the real world. Very specific examples given. And number 4, there's a sense that preparation for the next life depends on how this life is lived. One of the things I'll say in a couple of weeks, and I'll say it now, is that the only reason why I can put up with injustice in this life is because I know there's going to be justice in the next life. If there was no justice in the next life, then why should I care about justice in this life? It is the eternal nature of God who has established himself in his world to work in a certain way that gives us the standard for all of these things. And why is that? Because it's based on his image. We desire justice because we are frustrated by injustice when we see it around us. So, here's a summary statement. We create, we form, and we make. Why is that? Because this is the world that God has made. Every single one of us who does anything, and I don't care if you're washing dishes or changing diapers or taking care of whatever management responsibilities you have in the workplace, every single thing that we do is based on a real world that God has made. And we emphasized that a couple of weeks ago. We depend on the world. That is, that God has revealed himself in it, not only in his book, but in the book of God's world. And this is crucial for us to understand that we depend on not a chaotic world, but a world of order. So we enjoy this order and the predictability of it, and God has created a rhythm. So think about the seasons. We're now coming into fall. Think about evening and morning. All of those kinds of things matter to us because we're actually practicing the rhythm that God has established in his world. And we organize, evaluate, and appreciate. So anytime I see a really good play this afternoon during a football game, I am actually magnifying that which God has given to us to do, and that is to appreciate and to enjoy that which we do as human beings because God has established his world to work that way. So we are his representation, but also his representative, and that's crucial for us. So how does this fit within the book itself, that is, within Genesis? So we have to go all the way back to what does Genesis teach, and what framework, what cultural, historical framework was Genesis being written in? During the day, when Moses was writing this at about 1400 BC, he was dealing with worldviews that believed in stuff like what you're seeing on the screen. Huge, chaotic monsters. And these mythologies would produce these gods that were horrific and awful gods. And they were bloodthirsty gods. So when Moses was saying, look, here's Genesis 1 and 2, compare it now with the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian epic, what are we seeing the difference in? Chaos versus order. Gods versus the one and only true God. and God's made in human image, and humans made in God's image. Well, why is this important? Why does this matter? How should we apply these kinds of ideas? Well, I've talked about tyranny in the past few weeks. Let me talk about that again. When humans are created to serve the gods is a reflection of what we see in any tyrannical despotism any place in the world today. So here is a picture, for instance, of Jewish men during World War II who were producing for the Nazi regime because they were prisoners. And what do prisoners do? They produce. And if they don't produce, what happens to them? They're killed. Why is it so important to understand the difference between a dictatorship that you find in places like China or North Korea or Russia? Why is it important to note that, and the reason why this country is so distinctively different from all of those? It's hugely important, because in many, you have no freedom at all. In this one, you actually still have freedom, and that matters. And it is more of a representation of the way God has made his world. We also see this representation in the ancient world that only kings were made in God's image. That means that the despots, the tyrants, the rulers of our day, they want their picture everywhere because they want everybody to know that Big Brother is watching. I think there's been a book written about such things, 1984 comes to mind. The Hebrew view of work in all of this is that we are made in the image of God, and this means that we are his representation on earth, and it matters. And by the way, notice that picture. This is a picture of Marduk, one of the gods of the ancient world, and notice how human Marduk looks. We are making the gods in our own image, which really hasn't changed, considering that we still believe in material things being most important, and pragmatism, that is, just do it, being most important, and consumerism being most important. All of this comes out of this idea of production, and that people are made only to serve those who are in charge. We are also his representative on earth. Now you'll notice in this particular picture that the God is sitting on his throne, and the smaller figures are the kings. So while the king was made in the image of the God, we also understand that next to the God, the king was quite small. When we think about this, however, we understand that God gave representative duties to human persons, to people, that we might reflect who he is in the world around us. And in every single way that we do our work, it certainly shows up that way, counter to this, because slavery is the end result of a culture which elevates things over people. Now, I could launch into a long distinctive between the slavery that you see in so-called free nations and the slavery that is obviously the outcome of a totalitarian ruler. We'll save that perhaps for another time, but the idea here is that slavery is the end result. It starts with slavery and it ends with slavery, and it elevates things over people in every way. But we, as Christians, think differently. We actually care for people. That's the reason why Ms. Cohen's comments really kind of strike a bit of inconsistency, since it was the Hebraic Christian view of life and things that created hospitalization and health care. That we really care about representing people who can't represent themselves. That we stand up for those who can't speak for themselves. And we defend people in this way in justice. And then, of course, there's the issue of making sure that there's no divide between class and color and culture. That everybody is equal. And by equal, we mean we are all made in God's image. And that's a crucial concern for everybody. So while we're made in his image, we are his representation and we are his representative on earth. We are indeed co-workers with God. Now, because I work at university, one of the things that comes up from time to time is a push that we get through administrative channels that suggests that we should be concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so when my colleagues ask me, how do I deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion, I tell them, I just invite people to my classes who don't look like me. I don't talk about things, I just do them. I want people to see that there's a difference between how I think about things and how I do things. So I'm not going to browbeat my students in such things with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to bring folks to my classes who don't look like me. Larry Smith is going to be joining me this week, for instance, in one of my classes. And he is working for one of the oldest African-American newspapers in the United States, the Indianapolis Recorder. And we're going to be talking about writing and so on. But Larry's a great Christian believer and somebody who I esteem highly. And he loves to come to my classes and talk to my students. And he and I just carry on a conversation. So that my students literally see in front of them, hey, look at that. People can actually get along when they don't even look like each other. Imagine that. Or Chanel came to my class, first-year seminar class, and she gave a great presentation to students about how should they be planning for the future. But in all of these examples, Gerson Cardona was here a couple of weeks ago. He'll be here again this week in another class. I emphasize all of this to say that we actually have to do something with what we say we believe. And our doing of something emphasizes that we believe in the worth and the value and the dignity of all people. So that when we look at another person, not caring what they believe, not caring what their political stance is or their cultural stance or whatever the case, we look at people and see God, because every person is made in His image. And so we, as church people, should be very careful to be the leaders in this regard. We should be the first ones to say, this is important to us, and here's how we're going to go about making sure that people understand that this is important to us. So we bear responsibility for each other, and our humanness with each other demands that we be humane and treat each other with great dignity and care. And this is the whole point of this series, that we are looking at the world through the lens of the Word, that we think about being Christians differently than other people do from other viewpoints and philosophies and worldviews. Our view of life is very distinctive because it rests upon the Scriptures. And of course, if you recall, these statements are listed every single week, repeated themes in what we'll be emphasizing. And so today I wanted to emphasize that doctrine influences living. What we say we believe should influence how we live. Now, that doesn't always come across, but that should be our goal. Our emphasis should always be in that direction. So let's see what we can do about actually applying the image of God in people to everyday things that we see all around us. So think of the idea of design and architecture and building. Gee, where do you think we got that from? The image of God. Because God designed, was the architect of, and built His world. Really important ideas here for us to consider, that the image of God is in us and reflects His glory even in buildings around us. How about dance and ballet and opera? One of my former students from Michigan is an operatic soprano, and she travels the world singing. She's a brilliant voice. She actually sang here in Indy some years ago. And when I speak with her, she says, I want you to know that I'm an apostle of love, that is my focal point. And that is what she does in her testimony before others. How about this? Come on, admit you guys are watching the Great British Baking Show, aren't you? Yep. I know you are, because my wife is. So I do too. I'll just give it up. So all of this, even culinary arts, reflect the fact that there is a creator, and He's made us to be creative because we are creatures. And if I haven't said this before, maybe I should say it here. The Creator created creatures who creatively create from creation. That's our job. How about this? Art and painting and sculpture. Anybody who does this is reflecting the image of God in their artistic abilities and their creativity. Huge impact upon the world around us. That's why, by the way, we should celebrate anybody who is a believer, who practices these areas of life, whether it be in dance or in art or even in athletics or in building, whatever the case. All of these things reflect the fact that we have been made in God's image. And so, as usual, let's talk and end our discussion today with some questions. Why is projecting a certain image so important in a visual culture? And should we be surprised if the physical matters most? So, my very first lesson in a class called Reading, Writing, and Inquiry at IUPUI, I'd show about 8 or 10 commercials. And I asked my students, to tell us who is the audience for the commercial, and what is the message for the commercial, and what is the bridge that gets us there. And so this concept of the physical and the visual is imperative, even in advertising. Think about the power of advertising and answer that question: why should we be surprised if the physical matters most? We shouldn't be, but we should emphasize to people that the image of God is what projects all of this creativity. Number two, how do you feel when others judge you by your looks? Or how do you look at others? This is a big deal. If we only validate people on the basis of a physical external display of whatever the case may be, then certainly we are missing the idea that everybody's made in God's image and has worth and value and dignity, no matter what they look like or what they do. That's important to say. How should we treat people as people instead of resources? Oh boy, don't get me started on HR departments. Why in the world do we call it human resources, as if I am something to be used and then thrown away when you're done with me? Could we at least, please, could we at least go back to the concept of personnel? I mean, at least then you have the word person in personnel. I mean, if you got a way to make changes in your industry and whatever the case, please go ahead. You have my permission to make those shifts. HR, man. How do we remind ourselves that all artwork is a reflection of God's image in us? One of the things that I think would be really cool is if we would celebrate artistic achievement and endeavor. And we do every single Sunday. I mean, we have tremendous musicians here in this church. Wonderful, wonderful people who are really expert at their discipline. Could we expand that into the visual arts? And would that be something that would be profitable for us all? And why is it important that we compare and contrast other views of humanity with a Hebraic Christian perspective? Oh my. We live in a world that doesn't appreciate the fact that all of what I've taught this morning and all of its impact for the culture and the world in which they live and they espouse comes directly from a Christian point of view. So, back to Ms. Cohen and Washington Post and whomever else. Once you start saying to me that the internal person is much more important, then I'm going to ask you, on what basis will you say that? And just as much, I will say, if you're going to commit to an abortion perspective, I'm going to ask you, who do you think that person is in the womb? So every single time, as we think about these things from a Christian point of view, image is indeed everything, because it's God's image. Next week, bad to the bone. See you then.